Hi guys. So I want to do a quick screencast to help supplement classroom time that we're going to be losing this week while we work on the trial of John Adams. So as you know, in class this week, we're going to be spending a lot of time working on this trial. These screencasts are designed to give you a little outside information on the trial that we're not going to have the time to cover in class. So with that in mind, let me move forward. As we look at this trial of John Adams, what are the major issues? So some of the major issues are the interpretation of the Constitution. There's essentially two ways to interpret the Constitution. One is strict and the other is loose. Strict constructionists, for example, Thomas Jefferson, believed that the Constitution needed to be followed word for word. A good example of this is the National Bank. So, for example, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the federal government can create a national bank. Therefore, Thomas Jefferson was opposed to the creation of a national bank. Loose constructionists, like Hamilton, argued that the Constitution does say that the federal government can do anything that's necessary and proper for carrying out the powers that are expressly given to it. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful. What does that mean? It's best taught through an example. So, for example, a power that's expressly given or it's clearly written is the power to tax. Hamilton argued that it was necessary and proper to have a bank to keep this money in order to organize and keep this money and use this money, that a bank was necessary and proper, and that it was okay to stretch the Constitution to include things that weren't expressly given. That's why sometimes this clause is also called the elastic clause. With that in mind, how does that apply to this trial? Well, John Adams clearly does things that are not expressly written in the Constitution. So the defense is going to argue that he was essentially using the elastic clause or a loose interpretation of the Constitution. That's why Jefferson is such an important witness for the prosecution. The rise of political parties, the partisanship is a very important theme in this trial. I think if you look at um, John Adams's motivation, you can see that partly it's partisan, and I believe that Thomas Jefferson's motivation, in large part, is politically partisan. Early American foreign policy, especially the idea of impressment, both England and France were impressing American sailors. Washington tried to deal with that by declaring neutrality. Adams dealt with that by having a quasi-war. Jefferson dealt with that through the Embargo Act. Madison dealt with that by going to war with England. So looking at how these four presidents dealt with early American foreign policy is, needless to say, a really important theme. And then there's John Marshall. I'm going to direct you to a screencast that I've created. John Marshall is too big of an issue and person to be covered in just one slide of a screencast. So there's a screencast posted on my website on Marbury versus Madison. I want to really encourage you to watch it. In short, John Marshall defines the Supreme Court and in many ways defines the interpretation of the Constitution. So he's incredibly important to this trial. Moving forward now, although Washington is really important, and of course Washington's in the trial, and how Washington deals with things is really important. Really, the political battle here is between Jefferson and John Adams. They run against each other for the presidency in 1796. And in 1796, John Adams is going to win. 4 years later, Thomas Jefferson is going to win. So we're going to talk about the role that the Alien and Sedition Act played, John Adams's foreign policy in that 1800 election. But let's start with the 1796 election. What were the issues of the 1796 election? The Whiskey Rebellion, that comes up quite a bit in the trial. Jay's Treaty. Jay's Treaty was an attempt to deal with impressment. In many ways, it was seen as a failed attempt. And as George Washington's vice president, John Adams is blamed in part for it. And as I said earlier, the role of the federal government, strict and loose construction. What exactly should the federal government be doing? These were all issues in the election of 1796. John Adams wins, and then John Adams has to deal with these issues. And the issue that comes up is sometimes referred to as the XYZ affair. John Adams trying to negotiate with the French to stop the impressment led to this incident. And the incident, as you can read about, and I'm going to not go into great depth about it, but the incident was where French ambassadors demanded a bribe, $250,000. This really encouraged a tremendous amount of nationalism and pride in America. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent in tribute was a rally cry. Adams used this as an excuse and a reason to create a large navy and the Marine Corps, and he gets involved in an undeclared naval war with France. Now, this is obviously a huge part of the trial, and in many ways, trial aside, I want to say that John Adams' dealing with this situation was very adroit, very smart. That's my phone. I don't think anyone's really calling me. So I'm gonna work right through that. I think that was a mistake. Um, John Adams was very adroit in his dealing with this. Had he got involved in a full war with France, that could have been disastrous for a young America. But he was involved in this undeclared naval war, and in many ways protected American shipping, protected American seamen. He was really very adroit in his handling. But as you can imagine, not everyone supported it. So even though, and here's the other thing about this and the trial, the undeclared naval war was fairly popular, but you're never going to have a unanimous opinion on things. And there were critics. And to deal with these critics, John Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts involved new immigrants, and John Adams argued that these new immigrants needed to be in America longer before they can become citizens. Additionally, John Adams passed the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to impede the policies of the government or defame the officials. John Adams was called awful things by men like James Callender, and as you can imagine, he didn't like it very much. The other thing to remember is that this is the beginning of America, and John Adams is the first second president. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that because I realize that sounds silly. George Washington is clearly the first, but in some ways, how the second president handles things is just as important, and you could even argue more important than how George Washington handles things. So George Washington is kind of special. He's incredibly popular. He's the first. How does how does the second president handle things? And the second president, by the name of John Adams, had difficulty with the criticism, and he handled criticism that George Washington never dreamed of. And it's really fascinating to look at it in that lens. Now, Jefferson and his friend Madison, two very important people in this trial, write things called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And the Virginia and Kentucky resolution states that the independent states do not have to follow any laws that they believe are unconstitutional. And we call this the theory of nullification. Now, probably most people who are watching the screencast know that today the Supreme Court has the power to declare laws unconstitutional. But at this point, it was unclear who exactly had the power to declare laws unconstitutional. If you go back to the strict and loose constructionist arguments of government, it does not state anywhere in the Constitution who has the power to declare laws unconstitutional. Jefferson argued that the 10th Amendment said that any powers not expressly given to the federal government are reserved for the states. Therefore, the states have the power to declare laws unconstitutional. This is what's going to make John Marshall's decision in Marbury versus Madison all the more fascinating in that he was actually going against this idea that Jefferson had that the states should declare laws unconstitutional. Now, as we're going to find out, this Virginia and Kentucky resolution becomes a moot point because Jefferson's going to win in the election of 1800 and he's going to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts. But for years to come, the idea of whether or not states can nullify federal law is going to be a debate, and it's going to finally come to a boiling point during the Civil War. So you cannot underestimate the importance of this theory of nullification. Moving on, as I said before, Jefferson is going to win the election of 1800. And what's fascinating to me about the election of 1800 is that John Adams arguably passed the Alien and Sedition Acts for political reasons. He didn't want people criticizing him. He didn't want new immigrants voting for Jefferson. So you could argue that John Adams passed these for political reasons. And the great irony here is that it's probably the Alien and Sedition Acts that cost him his presidency. People thought that they were very, you know, undemocratic, that they denied people their natural rights as protected under the Bill of Rights. And Jefferson is able to win largely because of them. And to me, that's just so interesting. So now Jefferson's president. The election of 1800. Oh, I should have. There's a few more interesting things about the election of 1800 that I'm going to go over very quickly. Aaron Burr, we talked about him in class, and he's an incredibly important person in this trial. Aaron Burr runs with Jefferson, but at this point in time in American history, there was whoever won the most electoral votes became president. Whoever got the second most votes became vice president. And because these two men, Burr and Jefferson, were essentially running together, it was a tie. Burr, who is this incredibly opportunistic and ambitious man, claims the presidency for himself. If no person gets a clear electoral victory, the House of Representatives decides. The House of Representatives chose Jefferson, and later the 12th Amendment was passed to fix this problem. So the election of 1800, there were a lot of very interesting little wrinkles to it. Sometimes when we talk about the election of 1800, we call it the Revolution of 1800. It's interesting to note that when we talk about periodization, that period 3 begins at 1800. Clearly, 1800 is an important date, and it's an important date because Jefferson becomes president. It was a revolution. Jefferson once said, and I have to paraphrase, that it was a revolution as much as the revolution of 1776 was. So he does make some changes. He pardons all those seditionists. He gets rid of the big Navy and relies on these little tiny gunboats. He reduces debt. Remember, Jefferson's like a small government guy, and he repeals the excess tax. But perhaps more telling is what he keeps the same. He doesn't get rid of the National Bank. Remember Jefferson's argument and about the National Bank? He keeps it. He doesn't fire Federalists. He allows them to maintain their job. He generally retains a strong government, and he actually strengthens this idea of the elastic clause because when he bought the Louisiana Purchase, he used the elastic clause to do it. So the Revolution of 1800 is a very interesting idea, and it's one that comes up all the time. Moving right along, we've talked about this. Were the Alien and Sedition Acts politically motivated to silence criticism and to stop new immigrants from voting for Jefferson? Were they unconstitutional, or are they covered under the elastic clause? Are they necessary? Are they proper? These are all issues that are going to come up during the trial. The 10th Amendment is reserved powers. In class, sometimes I refer to the Constitution as a schizophrenic document. Depending on what page you're on, one page says you can do anything that's necessary and proper for carrying out the laws expressly given. The other page says anything that's not expressly given to the federal government is reserved to the states. That's the 10th Amendment. So the Constitution, some scholars argue, is purposefully written in this cryptic way so that it would be open for debate. It's a fascinating document. Moving right along, some important questions to think about during the trial. As I said before, how were these guys politically motivated? How were they motivated by sectionalism? Earlier, I talked about how John Adams, I think I talked about this in another screencast, how John Adams wanted to protect New England sailors and New England merchants. Well, where was John Adams from? What was Thomas Jefferson interested in terms of his section of the country, the South? How did the different views determine the constitutionality impact of these events? That's a very important question. And of course, just in general, the idea of the constitutionality of these laws. Moving right along, John Marshall is sometimes referred to as the ghost of the Federalist Party. We're close to Halloween, so this is spooky. John Marshall is the ghost of the Federalist Party because he sits on that bench for over 30 years. The Federalist Party is going to disappear, but John Marshall's still going to be there issuing decision after decision after decision. So one more time, I want to really encourage you to watch that screencast about John Marshall. I've got one eye on the clock. So I am leaning towards wrapping this screencast up. A few more notes here on John Marshall and how important he was to the interpretation of the Constitution and the role that the Supreme Court will play in the United States. Again, I'm going to skip right over this because I want you to watch the screencast that I made on Marbury versus Madison. Needless to say, Marbury versus Madison is very important to this trial. And foreign policy we talked about. So I think I am going to wrap this screencast up. I hope this is a benefit to you. I hope this acts as a good supplement for the work that you're doing in the trial. And of course, you can always come to me for any questions or concerns. Hope it helps.